In Oakland, Cassius is in a job interview for a telemarketer position at Regaleview. He's even brought a high school trophy and an Employee of the Month plaque. However, manager Anderson can tell all the experience on the resume is fake. One of the phone numbers belongs to Cassius' friend Salvador, who is applying for the same job and forgot to change his outgoing message, and Anderson used to work at the other place on the list, so he knows Cassius wasn't an employee there. Cassius has no choice but to admit that he made the plaque and the trophy, but Anderson doesn't care. He'll hire anyone here as long as they have initiative, so Cassius now has a job with a commission-only salary. The next morning, Cassius wakes up feeling philosophical. He asks his girlfriend Detroit if she ever thinks about growing old and dying because he's worried that he'll live his life without doing anything that matters. Detroit explains that little moments also matter because not everything has to be for posterity's sake. They start kissing and getting naughty, but they're interrupted by the door opening and the neighbors seeing what they're doing. It turns out Cassius has been living in his uncle's garage. Then Cassius turns on the TV and watches an ad for Worry-Free. The company refers to itself as a new lifestyle model because the workers live in the factory, so they're provided beds and food. They sell it as the perfect arrangement, but it feels like a prison, especially since their contracts are for life. On his way to work, Cassius is stopped by his uncle Sergio, who reminds him that he owes him 4 months of rent. Sergio is drowning in debt, so he gives Cassius 2 weeks to get him the money. Cassius complains about his uncle not being nice to his own family, so Sergio reminds him that he gave him a car, which barely works. When Cassius arrives at the office, he notices that there's a very fancy elevator at the back and stares at the boss, Mr. Bleep, whose name is censored whenever it's mentioned. Manager Johnny takes Cassius to his desk and explains that a light will be turned on whenever he makes a sale. If he works hard, he could become a power caller on the upper floors and make real money. Then Cassius makes his first call. He imagines himself appearing in front of a couple having breakfast, but the guy hangs up as soon as he says hi. The second call is picked up by a woman doing the naughty, and she also quickly hangs up. The elderly lady in the third call does listen to Cassius, but she explains that she doesn't have any money because her husband is in the hospital with cancer. Cassius doesn't know what to do and sees the sign reminding him to follow the script, which says he must make any problem a selling point. He tells her that the encyclopedia he's selling includes tips on how to stay healthy, causing her to hang up. The next day Cassius keeps failing to make any sales. His coworker Langston laughs at him and tells him to use his white voice. Cassius is confused by this and says that he's often told he sounds pretty white, but Langston explains that's only Will Smith white, which is just being proper. The real white voice doesn't have a care, it's paid its bills and is happy about the future. Langston clarifies that white people don't actually sound like that, it's what they wish they sounded like. He changes his voice to show off the trick and Cassius is in shock. It's almost like Langston is being dubbed. Sometime later, the employees attend a meeting to meet the new team leader Diana. She and Johnny keep trying to use corporate lingo to encourage the employees, saying they should think of a team as a family. Their metaphors fail and Cassius asks if this idea of working harder means they'll get paid more, but his question is ignored. Afterward Cassius tries to get a coffee from the machine but nothing comes out. His coworker Squeeze explains that the managers even make them pay for the snacks. Squeeze is very impressed by Cassius for speaking up during the meeting and reveals he's trying to convince the team to fight for a better salary. They obviously can't talk there, so Squeeze invites Cassius to a bar, promising to pay. In the evening Detroit is finishing her shift as a sign dancer on the street. Cassius picks her up and introduces her to Squeeze, explaining that she's an amazing artist. Detroit tries to compliment Cassius too by mentioning the great things he did in high school, but he stops her. He asks her not to talk about high school because that's in the past and as adults they shouldn't be stuck on their silly teenage achievements. As an example he points to the school's former football players, who now work at the furniture store and play football all day. Cassius thinks they're stuck, but Salvador thinks they're just friends having fun together. At the bar, the group watches the news and learns that the police have fought some protesters who call Worry-Free's lifetime contracts a new form of slavery. Worry-Free's CEO Steve said in an interview that it doesn't count as slavery simply because their workers don't sign the contracts under threats of physical violence. The protests have been organized by a group known as Left Eye Faction, who wear a black mark under their left eye. An activist explains that there's almost no normal employment because Worry-Free is replacing everything, even sweatshops. Their facilities are like prisons where employees work for 14 hours and are fed slop. Cassius and his friends are having fun chatting and drinking. When it's time to make a toast, Cassius reveals he's perfected his white voice, leaving everyone in shock. They start talking about work and Squeeze says that the power caller promise is a lie, it's something the managers say to keep employees from giving up. He pulls out some flyers and says they need to form a union so they can get paid properly. The next morning Cassius tells Sergio that he gets paid on Friday, so he'll pay all his rent then. However, Sergio doesn't care anymore, even Cassius's money won't be enough to pay his debt. The bank will take the house soon, so Cassius needs to start looking for a new place. Sergio is so desperate that he's starting to consider working for Worry-Free. At the office, Cassius manages to connect with clients thanks to his white voice. Johnny is very impressed and comes to his desk to celebrate every time he makes a sale. He also claims that the bosses are talking about Cassius' success, so he may become a power caller soon. It's then revealed that Detroit's working half-time at Regaleview too. The next time they go to the bar, Squeeze shows Cassius the newspaper. Sadly, the Senate committee has cleared Worry-free of all slavery charges. The bar's TV is playing a show called I Got the Poop Kicked Out of Me, where players get beaten up and humiliated in camera just for the laughs. Squeeze thinks it's depressing that this is the most popular show in the country, getting 150 million viewers every night. The next morning, Squeeze organizes the team for their first act of protest. When he says phones down, everyone will stop working for 20 minutes. He asks if anyone wants to back down now, and Cassius hesitates a little before showing support. On his way to his desk, Cassius can't stop staring at the special elevator, which is noticed by Mr. Bleep. In the afternoon, Squeeze yells phone down and everyone starts chanting insults against the company. Cassius is hesitant at first but ends up yelling and clapping along, feeling like he's finally doing something important. Sometime later, Cassius is called to the manager's office. When they tell him he needs to grab his things and leave, he starts insulting them, refusing to stop fighting for a good cause. However, the managers explain he must take his things to the first floor because he's been promoted to power caller. Johnny notices Squeeze and Salvador at the window, so he closes the blinds. Cassius feels torn and imagines the football players in the office as a sign that he's also getting stuck in this job. However, when the managers tell him how much money he'll make and open a champagne bottle, he happily celebrates and drinks too. The next day, Cassius comes to work wearing the only suit he's got. Diana takes him to the fancy elevator, where she has to enter an extremely long password to make it work. The elevator's voice welcomes Cassius and compliments him with some strange and naughty comments. On the first floor, Cassius finally meets Mr. Bleep, who also uses a white voice and tells him they must always talk like this here. Mr. Bleep explains that they sell power in two forms, firepower and manpower. Cassius is horrified to realize that he'll be selling weapons and Worry-free's workforce, which is essentially slavery. Thanks to those lifetime contracts, they don't have wages, so they can build cars for the cost of a bicycle. At first, Cassius is hesitant, but he quickly gets to work when he's told how much money he'll make. Meanwhile, an activist is vandalizing a Worry-free sign on the street. Soon a man calls her out and she has to run away. When she's far enough, she takes off her disguise to reveal Detroit, who turns out to be part of Left Eye. Afterward, she goes to work and is visited by Squeeze, who also knows a few cool moves to do with the sign. He learned this in Los Angeles, where he helped sign twirlers to unionize too. Detroit shares that she uses her art to help the revolution, so Squeeze asks about her relationship with Cassius because he doesn't seem as radical as she is. She swears it's fine, but her answer is awkward. Then Squeeze notices a little paint on her cheek left by the left eye mark and offers to give her a ride, but she says Cassius will pick her up. Hours pass and Cassius is still at the office because he has to learn the new rules, products, and script. Detroit gets tired of waiting and has to call a friend to ask for a ride. When Cassius finally leaves the office, he goes to the gallery and apologizes to Detroit, explaining he's been promoted to power caller and he's only telling her now because he hadn't been sure if it was real. She asks what he sells now, but he quickly changes the subject to her art. While Detroit explains the message behind her pieces, Cassius doesn't really pay attention. He's so tired that he can only look at her cigarette. When she finally shares it with him, he feels more awake and can truly listen to her. The next day, Cassius finds Squeeze organizing the team again. He tells them that he's a power caller now, so he'll support his friends, but from the sidelines, mentioning Sergio's debt as a reason. Salvador calls him out for selling out and an argument ensues, although it's mostly compliments told passively aggressively. Langston has to stop them and Cassius rushes inside to ignore the protest. In his new fancy office, Cassius makes his first call and chats with an important Japanese businessman, imagining himself appearing in the bathroom with him. Using his white voice, Cassius explains that Worry-free can build products for less money, and the businessman loves the idea of doubling up his market share to beat his competition. Moments later, Mr. Bleep announces that Cassius made a very important sale on his first day and they have a toast. Cassius shares his bad situation and asks if he can be paid now. Mr. Bleep is so happy about the deal that he agrees. After work, Cassius gives Sergio enough money to pay off his debt. Day after day he keeps making big business deals, so soon he has a fancy new car and his own apartment with beautiful furniture and decorations. One morning, Cassius turns on the TV and finds a news report about the strike at Regaleview. All his friends are protesting outside and not letting anyone enter the building. Regaleview is tired of this, so it's hired a security company that will violently push the protesters to help the power callers get to work. When Detroit wakes up, Cassius talks to her in his white voice. She calls him out and he apologizes, saying he did it without thinking. Detroit thinks that's a bad sign and says she can't do this anymore. Cassius has been going to work in the middle of the protest, and Detroit thinks he's betraying the cause and his friends. An argument ensues and they end up fighting over the covers. After falling off the bed, Cassius says he wanted a good job to be more interesting for her. However, Detroit explains she already liked the old Cassius and if today he crosses the picket line, their relationship is over. Outside the building, Cassius and the other power callers are surrounded by the guards, who start beating up the protesters to open the way. Cassius ends up crossing the picket line anyway. In the evening, Mr. Bleep has another celebration for Cassius because he's been having lots of successful sales. Afterward he drives by Detroit's gallery, but decides not to visit her since they aren't together anymore. The next day, the guards beat the protesters to open the way again. Cassius tries to move fast, but an activist manages to hit him in the head with a soda can. Instead of going home, Cassius gets a bandage and keeps working. Mr. Bleep is so impressed that he invites him to a party thrown by CEO Steve, and Cassius promises to go later because he has another event first. In the evening, Cassius goes to the opening of Detroit's gallery, and she overhears her using her white voice to sell her work. He tries to compliment her art, but she can't stand being with his current self. Then Salvador calls Cassius a sellout and reveals that the video of him getting hit by the can has gone viral. Squeeze tries to convince him to fight for the cause from his new position since it'd be a powerful statement, but he's interrupted when the performance begins. Detroit appears on the stage wearing only rubber hands on her chest and groin. In some containers, there are broken phones, used bullet casings, and balloons filled with sheep's blood. They all represent various businesses that abuse Africa's workforce. She wants the audience to throw them at her while she recites quotes from the movie The Last Dragon. The first few minutes Detroit gets to talk peacefully, but soon the crowd starts throwing things at her without a care. Cassius freaks out and stops them, however Detroit says he's ruining her show and kicks him out. At a very fancy mansion, Steve consumes illegal sugar to kick off the party. Cassius finally gets to meet him and has to use his white voice while they chat. Steve makes Cassius sit in the middle of the crowd and asks for fun stories from the hood, so Cassius has to explain he was never in a gang. Then Steve makes him drop the white voice and asks him to rap. Cassius says he can't, but Steve refuses to believe that a black guy can't rap and keeps asking, causing the crowd to chant the request too. Folding under pressure, Cassius tries to make up a few rhymes, but they're all silly and the crowd is bored. Desperate to impress them, Cassius starts repeating the N-word with lots of energy, and the guests are happy to sing along. Afterward the party turns naughty, but Cassius refuses to join the pile of naked strangers. Mr. Bleep finds him alone in a room and tells him that Steve wants to see him in private. Cassius goes to Steve's office and consumes some illegal sugar from a horse plate. Steve has a big business offer to make and wants Cassius to watch a movie explaining it, however Cassius needs to go to the bathroom first. In the corridor, Cassius enters the wrong door. He finds a strange room and just one stall with a voice asking for help. When this voice says he's in great pain, Cassius opens the stall and is horrified to see a humanoid horse with a huge member falling out. The creature begs for mercy and Cassius steps away, only to bump into more horses behind curtains also asking for help since they're all in chains and in pain. A terrified Cassius runs back to the corridor and bumps into Steve, who is holding a gun. Since Cassius has peed his pants, Steve takes him back to his office and plays the movie to explain what happened. Using stop-motion animation, the video tells the story of how humans evolved to use tools. Humanity is always inventing new tools, but labor continues to be limited because of the body's shortcomings. That's why Worry-Free has developed a chemical that can make people more efficient, durable, stronger, and therefore more profitable. This chemical transforms humans into horse-like creatures called equisapiens and looks like sugar. Seeing this, Cassius freaks out because he thinks Steve made him consume that chemical. However, Steve assures him that he only gave him recreational sugar. He explains that they're making millions of equisapiens, which means they'll have their own society and culture soon. The company wants to prevent a union or rebellion, so they want one of their employees inside to keep things under control. Steve will pay Cassius $100 million if he agrees to be the equisapien leader for 5 years, and at the end he'll get an antidote to be human again. However, Cassius thinks it crosses a line and money won't change his mind this time. The next morning, Cassius finds an article talking against Worry-Free. He looks for his cell phone but he can't find it, so he uses his landline to call the newspaper and tells the journalists about the horse experiments, but nobody believes such a crazy story. When he turns on the TV, he discovers that a host is teaching kids how to make a wig that represents the can incident. Later at the doctor's office, he hears on the news that the activist who threw the can at him now has a contract with the soda brand. Cassius asks the doctor if he's becoming a horse by showing him his member, and the doctor kicks him out. At his apartment, Cassius asks Detroit the same question, but she says his member is the same size. She also complains because he tried to call her last night, so Cassius reveals he lost his phone. Detroit shares that she received a video message from his number that she didn't open because she thought it was dirty, so they watch it together now. It turns out his phone fell when he ran from the horse and accidentally video called Detroit. It recorded the equisapiens, the scientists injecting them with sedatives, and Steve threatening to turn them into glue. Afterward, Cassius and Detroit get naughty, although Detroit warns him that this is just a fling and they can't get back together. Cassius swears he's changed and he won't be a power caller again, yet this isn't enough for her. After Cassius falls asleep, Detroit sneaks out to prepare a new plan with the left eye. The next morning, a statue appears in front of Steve's mansion showing a man getting dirty with a horse. A sign says Worry-Free is turning workers into horses, but people think it's a metaphor. Meanwhile, Cassius goes for a walk around the neighborhood, but people keep mocking him for the viral video and even throw drinks at him. The humiliation gives Cassius an idea. The next day, a new soda ad shows the activist kissing an actor playing Cassius. When the I Got the Poop Kicked Out of Me show begins, Cassius appears as the new player. He agreed to participate in exchange for playing his video, but first he has to go through several painful and humiliating games. After he gets beaten up and covered in poop, the show finally plays the video of the Equisapiens. For the next few days, Cassius appears in multiple serious shows to warn people about worry-free. Unfortunately, the world is corrupt and Steve is seen as a genius for helping the economy with more efficient labor, causing worry-free stocks to skyrocket. One afternoon, Cassius meets with Squeeze and Salvador. He apologizes for betraying them and promises to fight with them from now on. He also expresses his frustration because nobody is taking his warning seriously, so they need to stop the power callers from crossing the picket line tomorrow to get a win on TV. When they look out the window, they notice that all the kids are wearing wigs for Halloween. Cassius spends the rest of his day planning. He contacts the football players and moves Detroit's sculptures. By looking at the video, he learns the password to Steve's lock and sneaks inside the mansion. The next day the protesters are using the wigs to reclaim their meaning. The guards start beating them up to open their way, only to crash into Detroit's disguised statues. Once the guards are weak, the football players finish taking them down, causing the power callers to walk away. The protesters celebrate their victory, but sadly they're interrupted when backup arrives. Chaos takes over the street as the guards beat everyone up and even use gas. Cassius rushes to hide with his friends and calls his own backup, but at that moment a guard knocks him out. When Cassius wakes up, he's inside the guard's van. He looks out the window and discovers that guards are still brutally beating up the protesters. However, the fight takes a turn when the Equisapiens show up. It turns out Cassius freed them in exchange for their help. Using their enhanced bodies, the Equisapiens easily defeat the guards and break the van door open to release Cassius. When a company helicopter appears with a searching light, the Equisapiens have no choice but to run away. The protesters still consider this a win and Detroit is so impressed by Cassius' plan that she gets back together with him. Afterward, Cassius moves back to his uncle's garage, but he keeps the nice furniture in his car. With his last money, he buys a nice car for Salvador as an apology for his betrayal. When Detroit comes to see him, their romantic moment is interrupted by overwhelming pain. Cassius looks up to discover that he's turning into an Equisapien after all. Sometime later, Steve hears the doorbell. When he checks the cameras, he's horrified to discover that Cassius is leading the Equisapiens to invade his mansion. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.